Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? That great. So I normally speak about map design, but today I'm actually talking about teaching. This talk should be helpful for anyone who teaches GIS or cartography, or has to write instructional documents for students or employees, or for those of you who just like to share your knowledge for fun. So I'm going to try to share some tips about writing tutorials. I've been writing, editing, and updating tutorials at Esri since 2018. I work on a team called Esri Tutorials. You can find our work at learn.arcgis.com, and all the materials we create are free to access. What are our tutorials like? What is the style or framework that I'm working within? We have a big focus on real-world scenarios. We provide all of the data for the tutorials, lots of screenshots, and we provide all of the choices. So it's never a situation of like, use whatever data you want. We will use whichever field we want, use whichever color you want. We always tell you which field and color to use. And we describe every single click. So this can seem tedious to some of you who are more experienced. And if you are teaching a lab, you may not need to do this, but our tutorials are used completely independently. We're never there in the classroom to help somebody when they can't find a button. So yeah, we describe every click. This means we don't have to guess at what people know and what they don't know. They're always going to be able to follow along. And we try to explain why you're doing things at every step. So that's our style at Esri Tutorials. I really like it, but you may have good reasons for doing things differently if you're writing your own tutorials in a different context. I just wanted to lay out the context that I'm working within before presuming to give any advice. So let's get into that advice. The first step, as with any Carto project, is find data. And I think it's the hardest part, but it's worth putting extra effort in up front. If you find that perfect data set that allows you to naturally show all of the skills and concepts, it's going to make a cleaner, shorter, and more convincing tutorial. If you try to force a tutorial out of a random data set just because it's the one that you happen to have, it's not going to make very much sense to the learner. Now, you can fake your data a little bit. For example, maybe I want to teach choropleth mapping, but my data doesn't have any numeric fields, so I might add an extra field with population data. But I'm only going to do this if it's realistic that this particular data set would have population data and if I can actually find the real population data. So yeah, you can fake it, but if the moment it starts to feel fake, it doesn't work very well. Next is the scenario. A scenario is just the setup for the tutorial. Why are you doing this thing in the first place? The data in this scenario are usually one and the same, so I'm usually searching for them and testing them at the same time. And they don't need to be grand or elaborate. Here's a simple example. There's a field in your data set that's formatted incorrectly, and you need to fix it. So that's the setup. That's why you're doing these things. A longer tutorial might have a more involved scenario. This one I did recently is there's some new construction plan in your city, and you need to update the utility network to accommodate it. So that's the context for why you're doing these steps. In the real world, why would you do them? Our tutorials are really hinging on these scenarios. Now, this might not be necessary for you, but I recommend giving it a try anyway. There's a lot of value to use them. They're not just a cute sentence in the introduction paragraph. They're really the glue that holds the rest of the tutorial together. So some of those benefits that you get, it helps to demonstrate the real world value of the workflow, helps the learner understand why they should bother to learn this thing, helps them decide if they should do the tutorial or not. Does this scenario have parallels with my own scenario? Is it going to help me solve my current problem, or should I keep looking for a different tutorial? It helps to justify all of the choices made throughout the tutorial. So why did we choose this field? Well, because in our scenario, we're supposed to be designing a map about X, and we think that this field best communicates X. This other field is a little harder to understand. And scenarios also make writing the tutorial a lot easier. Not at first, because crafting that scenario is really hard, but once you have it, all of your other choices are easier, especially when you need to decide which steps to keep and which to toss. If you have a scenario to refer to, It's a lot clearer to see which steps are essential to that scenario and which are kind of distractions from it. For a map design tutorial, scenario is usually going to be, you need to design X kind of map for X kind of client. So the map's purpose and audience is your scenario. And this is great because it means you're not only going to be teaching which buttons to click, but how to make design decisions. We chose green because the map is about nature conservation. We added a locator map because our audience are tourists who may not be familiar with this area. We classified the data into 3 bins because this map is intended for quick decision making and we don't want to give them too many choices. So the scenario allows you to teach concepts so your tutorial is not just button clicking. And as I've been saying, it's really important to explain why choices are made all the way along. Now, practically speaking, I do this right after the first draft. So I have my draft, has all my steps, I review it, and I ask why. Why did we choose this field and not that one? Why this tool parameter? Why this color? Why this projection? Why this base map? Is this an arbitrary choice just based on taste? Or would there be consequences if the learner deviated and chose something else? So here's an example. I tell the user exactly which color to pick, but then I tell them why. So I said, this color is a very desaturated blue, almost a pure gray. The dull color helps to lower the visual hierarchy of the lakes and makes them look like they're part of the base map. This kind of explanation gives the learner the tools they need to make their own decisions later. Now, sometimes the choices you make are pretty arbitrary, but you can explain that to people so that they don't make the mistake that, oh, I have to do it this way. So here I said the cutoff value of 250 is arbitrary, and when you design your own maps, you'll have to experiment to make choices like this one that balance information with clutter. So the learner, they're going to have to make their own choices later with their own maps, and it's your job to help them understand what the parameters are of those choices. When can you choose whatever font you want, and when is it important to choose a certain kind of font? So next I wanted to share some tips and tricks for writing tutorials. I've only chosen a handful in the interest of time. First is the order of writing. You can do things whatever way you want, but this is how I like to do things. I write out all of the steps first. Zoom here, click here, open this menu, click here. Then when that's done, I go back in and I add all of the explanations. The why you clicked here, the what did you see when you zoomed in here. Then I add introduction and conclusion paragraphs. And last, I add screenshots. If you add the screenshots at the beginning, you're going to waste a lot of time because they're definitely going to change later. So I add those last. Consistency is instruction is really helpful for learners. For example, if sometimes you tell them to clear the selection, but sometimes you don't tell them to clear the selection, that is going to throw people off. It's such a tiny thing, but you should either always tell them to clear the selection or never tell them, or maybe just tell them at the very beginning and say, from now on, you're expected to do this on your own. Same goes for closing pop-ups, simple things like that. The thing is that the learner doesn't know where you're going with this. So maybe it was important to leave the feature selected because you're about to use it in a tool. They don't know. And if you're inconsistent with those simple instructions, you're going to lose their trust and they're going to start going off script and they're going to get lost. Another good tip is to write instructions in the order that matches the learner's actions. Here's an example. In English, I would normally write this instruction like, type Kangaroo Island, South Australia, in the text box of the element pane. However, the learner has to find the element pane first. Only then can they find the text box, and only then can they type into it. So in a tutorial, I would flip the order of the sentence and I would write, in the element pane for text, type Kangaroo Island, South Australia. So the order of the sentence matches the order of the things that the learner has to do. And finally, never say that something is simple or easy or obvious. People do this often because they're trying to be encouraging, but in fact, people do not like to be told that the thing that they're currently struggling with is easy. and you do not know what people are going to struggle with. So you just leave all of those words out. Tutorial works better without them. All right, so everybody wants shorter tutorials. This is a significant challenge for those of us who write them, but the fact is that it's hard to convince people to do an hour-plus long tutorial. They are willing to do lots of 15-minute tutorials. So there's two main strategies that I use for dealing with this. The first is to break the workflow up into shorter pieces. So you could have the same long workflow, but instead of one really long tutorial, you've got like 5 really short ones. This is a lot more work for me, but it's worth it because the chances that somebody's actually going to do them is much higher. So I recommend this method. Here's some examples. Cartographic creations in ArcGIS Pro and cartographic creations with web maps. So these are 2 tutorial series. Each one teaches the full Carto workflow from start to finish. You've got symbology, base maps, projections, data management, labels, pop-ups, and layouts. But instead of being this really long, intimidating thing, you've got 4 or 5 short tutorials. Feels more manageable to the learner, and it also means it's more flexible. So if somebody only wants to learn about pop-ups, they can just jump in at the pop-ups part. They don't have to do all the other stuff first. The other method is to identify the one most important skill and just teach that and throw everything else out. You want to provide the map already set up with all of the things that the learner needs. All of the symbology's done, all the data prep's done. They just need to open the map, do the one thing, save the map, and they're done. It's amazing. That sounds like I said that in a second, but that will take 15 minutes in a tutorial. Here's some examples. Common skills for working with data in ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Pro. These are 2 tutorial series. They each have 10 tutorials, and those tutorials are only 10 to 15 minutes long. Now, when I wrote these, I wanted to teach some basic data management skills, and there were so many things I wanted to teach, and I knew nobody was going to do a 2-hour-long tutorial called data management. So instead, I wrote these short ones. There's one that you just learn how to do a clip. You open the map, you do a clip, you save the map, that's done. And they've been really popular. So it's hard to just cut everything out, but if you think of it more like I'm going to teach those other things in a different place, and this one's just about clip, I think it's a successful approach to making things short. And I've also found that those short tutorials are a lot easier to maintain and update than the long ones, so there's benefits to you as well as the learner from making things short. So those are the 4 series I just showed. If you're looking for lab materials for your students, I recommend these. The green one actually was just published yesterday, and for anyone who's skeptical about teaching cartography in ArcGIS Online, I wrote that for you. And Introduction to Cartography is a full self-guided course that I maintain and develop and includes most of the materials I just showed, as well as a lot of short videos. Now, in my abstract, I promised to relate cartography to writing. Many of you have probably read Strunk & White's The Elements of Style. It's a classic. If you haven't read it, I know it looks boring, but it's actually very engaging. I learned a lot in this book that helped me write tutorials, but I was also really surprised by how relevant this book was to making maps as well. Not all that stuff about grammar, but this sort of stuff. I'll read you this quote. Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences. For the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines, and a machine no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all his sentences short, or that he avoid all detail and treat his subject only in outline, but that he make every word tell. Now, as cartographers, this paragraph might ring some bells. I think there's a tendency, especially amongst new cartographers, and I certainly was not immune to this, to want to include lots and lots of detail in our maps because detailed maps are so beautiful. And I think this is similar to the desire in writing to use beautiful, flowery, descriptive language with lots of big words and long sentences. But what you learn as a cartographer, as you become more experienced, is that less is usually more. Maps are usually tools of science communication. We're trying to communicate as clearly and unambiguously as possible. So, same with, I lost my train here, but for the same reason, we want to keep our maps clear. We want to keep our language clear. And I think they're kind of the same skills. For the same reason that you want to use consistent colors and fonts in your maps, well, that's the same reason why we want to use consistent terminology and sentence structure in our tutorials. The question, do I really need to keep this layer, is very similar to the question, do I really need to keep this step? So that paragraph about vigorous writing is really the mantra that I try to follow in both tutorial writing and map making. I think tutorials, writing them has made me a better cartographer. It's gotten me into this habit of justifying every single choice, every word, every element. Does this really need to be here? Do I really know why I made this choice, why I chose this color? So similarly, if you're already good at designing maps, I would say that you already have the skills to write good tutorials. Map making and tutorial writing, very similar tasks. It's all about clear and unambiguous communication. And I think if you bring the same spirit that you take to your map making and apply it to writing tutorials, you're going to do just great. Thank you.
We do have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question about troubleshooting and how, when to include those. I find that's one of the key things for me in writing a tutorial, is that often people might think that they know these steps, so they start skipping things, or just the fact that they might be hitting a key and the next key over is one that puts them in trouble. So, do you insert these into your tutorials, or do you have recommendations of how to do that?
Yeah, I think the best tutorials have some troubleshooting in them, but it does come up against the challenge of keeping things short. I think ideally I'm aiming for a sweet spot of one little bit of troubleshooting. So if you have the data set up properly and you find just the right data set that does this, where the user does the step and then you teach them how to assess the results and know whether or not the thing that they did worked and how to fix the thing when it didn't work. So you intentionally make them do it wrong the first time. I would only do that if it's like a really common thing that people often get wrong. I wouldn't want to do that for some niche thing.
Any other questions? All right, please. One more. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering how you go about soliciting feedback from your tutorials, if you've learned any things that are more effective at getting people to offer what was useful or not so helpful for them.
Yeah, questions about feedback. So our tutorials go through quite a lot of review before they get published. That's all internal to Esri. We do have feedback form on our tutorials, so we get a lot of, if a step is broken, we hear very quickly. Unfortunately, I can't say that that feedback tends to be when steps are broken. So I haven't gotten a lot more specific. I like when you do it this way versus I don't like when you do it that way. So if anybody here has advice on that they'd like to pass on to me, that's part of why I'm here, is to learn those things.
All right. Thank you, Heather.